Okay, hi everyone that just came in. I'm just wrapping up a presentation here. And I'm going to share my screen again. And I will be sure to share these slides for folks that came in a little bit later. Okay, so a little bit of some findings from the student survey that led to the state mandate to label courses low cost, or OER, no textbook required. And a little bit more about this. So OER, no textbook to purchase, generally means a course that uses open educational resources as the primary required instructional materials for the course. A printed version and some supplementary course materials may be available for purchase in the bookstore. And low cost means to be designated as low cost, the combined cost of the required course materials should be $50 or less. Okay. And if you need more information about this, there's a link here that provides some information about the mandate to label courses as OER and low cost. And if you're wondering where your course might fall in that spectrum, there's a handy tool on there to actually figure out if your course is low cost or OER. There's also just some more background information, including ways to find the results of the various studies that they did. So the state surveyed students, which is where the findings I pulled are from the 2017 survey. They also polled faculty and staff as well about some of these labels and the way that these labels are named in the catalog. And this is something that I think at Shoreline CC, we're hoping will be ready in the summertime. So definitely by fall, but probably by the summertime, this will be available in the course catalog to search by OER and low cost. Okay, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and admit some more folks. Okay, and then we're going to go ahead and get started on our panel. Okay, so I have a list of questions here, but if the conversation if we kind of go off and find something else interesting to talk about, I'm totally open to, we don't necessarily have to go, for every question. So to start with, I'm going to ask Brandon, Stephanie, and Michael to share a little bit about what drew them to using OER as the primary materials in their course or program. So I don't know if I wanted to, do you want me to call on someone, or would someone like to go first?
So I'll just jump in.
Great, thanks, Brandon.
So I started using it because as a college student myself, I had a hard time paying for books. And so I didn't want to push that off onto my students. I remember one class I really wanted to take, my book was like almost $300, and it was book or class. And I chose the class because I really liked the topic, and it was only taught like once a year. And so I just went without the book itself. So I didn't want to push that off onto my students. I don't think that the book should have costed more than the class itself.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead, Michael.
I was just going to echo what Brandon said. I mean, that's something that I sort of realized as well, which is these books cost a lot of money. You use them once, maybe you can resell them, but very few students are going to keep them. But what I also liked a lot about the concept of OER was I could use different resources to cobble together more information for my students to give them more access points into material, rather than just one textbook that I maybe use half of. So I like the flexibility of being able to provide them with more information and more ways to think about the information.
Number one for me was equity. That was my main motivation. And this panel right now is situated in the time of our day labeled as the future, but I would argue that it has one foot in the trauma and healing section as well, and one foot in the future section, because it is traumatic to not be able to afford your textbooks. It is traumatic to have to wait for that financial aid check. It is traumatic to have to take on extra hours at work because you can't afford those books, and those things affect our most marginalized students.
Thank you. That's a really good point. And thank you, Michael and Brandon, for sharing the reasons why you got into using OER. And I'm curious, did anyone have any hesitations about adopting OER? If so, what were they?
I had hesitations only because when I first heard about OER, all I heard was negative connotations linked to it. Many faculty saying there wasn't good resources out there for classrooms. And so I kept pushing it off and pushing it off until I went into actual training and learned how to look up OER materials.
Great, thank you.
I guess I can go next. We'll follow the same order. I mean, I think my hesitation was similar. I felt it a rather daunting task to try and find sources. They're out there, but at least when I first was becoming aware of OER 3 or 4 years ago, or whenever, I wasn't exactly sure where to look, and it seemed almost insurmountable task to try and find what I needed. And I think this is changing, but at the time where I was first starting to look at OER, so much of it was STEM oriented and there wasn't as much in the humanities. And so I think my first attempt to find things, I ran away in fear because I couldn't find anything in a quick, easy fashion.
Thank you.
It took me a few years too to find resources that I was happy with, both content-wise and accessibility-wise. And I also had hesitation about, for me, it was changing the entire department, all 8 of our courses over, and how is that going to affect the lives of all the associate faculty in the department? And I could not, this project in my department could not have happened without the support of administration, for sure. This is not something I could have pulled off. So I think it's really important that we look for support throughout the college.
Great, thank you. And it looks like there's some activity in the chat as well. So I'm gonna, I sent the list of questions ahead of time, but I'm gonna jump around just a little bit. So I'm curious for the panelists, how have you used open educational resources or open materials to increase equity and access to course materials?
I feel just having it right away starts to build that equity because students have access to that material right away. So I saw once that I implemented OER into the classroom, I didn't have emails from students in those first 2 weeks saying, hey, I need extra times. I don't have the book yet. Can you wait to go over material until I get the book? So I think right there builds that equity so that students are on time. They're not panicking to get the book. Bookstore doesn't have it. They ran out. There's no used books, those type of things. So I feel like right off the bat, it's starting to build part of that.
Yeah, early access. Folks don't have to wait, right, to get their money, their financial aid money, or to wait for the bookstore to get it. Great.
I think in addition to that, when I think OER, I think electronic, right? So it's already something that provides itself for students who need like a screen reader or need some other way to access something. All that said, I prefer physical copies myself. It's easier for me to read, but having that option to, they can print something out if they need to. I think that equitable aspect of, just allowing access.
I just echo that. Yes, day one, everybody has the materials, and then it's important to me that they can access those materials on different types of devices. If their phone is all they have on day one because they're checking out a laptop from the library and it hasn't come through, they can still do what they need to do there. I'd also point out that not all online resources necessarily are accessible. That was something that I got to learn a lot about, and Amy Rovner helped me a lot there. So making sure to dig into that and look and see what the standards are for the particular resource that you're looking at.
Great. Yeah, that's a good point about accessibility, right? Okay, great. Thank you. So how did you go about locating and evaluating OER materials? Kind of jumping off Stephanie's last point, it was sometimes accessibility was an issue, or Michael and Brandon, you mentioned that sometimes it was a little difficult to find materials that were not maybe STEM focused. Curious how you went about locating materials for your courses.
So for me, I just started with a Google search, and then from there, I was kind of learning on my own how to find OER. And then I found OpenStax, which was for me pretty a good website for a variety of courses that you can have. I also reached out to the associations that I was a part of. So like Anthropology Association, Sociology, Peace and Justice Associations. And they have a lot of material themselves. It's not textbooks in general, but it's a bunch of classroom materials like videos, homework assignments, syllabi, like you were talking about. So a lot of those associations that I was a part of had that, and it was easy for me to find through them. And it's a whole bunch of people who are already implementing it in the classroom, and it was just really easy to just incorporate into the classroom. So it's like OpenStax, and then my associations definitely helped.
I didn't think of that. Reaching out to associations, a good way to go about it. I was directed initially to OER Commons, which is a searchable database. And then I've poked around on Creative Commons, just seeing what's out there and finding things. Somebody in the chat had mentioned using different chapters or different authors from different sources. That's definitely something that I do as well when I find them. But I think, so part of the question that you had asked, Caitlin, was, how do you sort of vet those sources? And that's for me, the most time-consuming part, because, I could find something that is how to create a thesis statement, but I might not agree with something in that source. And so then that one's gone, now I've got to go to another. So that said, I do feel like it's time well spent, because when I find those good sources, there's one, I can't remember the exact name, but I think it's the writers, WAC, I think is the acronym, but it's a bunch of essays by instructors about different aspects of research and writing that are very easy to read. And I've used them again and again and recommended them to other people because I know that they are OER. And, obviously it's not just about finding the resources, but then also sharing them with colleagues.
I used Merlot, and University of British Columbia has something called Open UBC. I found that really helpful. And then I look to the California community colleges for so much stuff, you guys. I do. I'm like, what are they up to? And then I have my favorite campuses in California that I look to specifically, and they have a ton of OER stuff. Actually, some of their campuses are really rich in that way. So, I'll take from anybody. And there's always, for me, there's always going to be things that are not treated in exactly the way I would treat them, but I just bring that out to my students, and I'll say, and then I'll make a video or somehow engage or discuss that particular thing. And that was true when I was using publisher materials too.
Great. Oh, and it looks like there's a couple of links in the chat to some of these. And I try to write a little bit of a summary, but please feel free to edit it if I miss anything. I kind of missed the school that you mentioned, Stephanie, but I just said California has a lot of cool OER stuff going on. Okay. All right. So I guess, one thing that I'm curious about is, so you mentioned contacting associations, which is a great way to find stuff, Googling. figuring out who's kind of doing a lot of cool stuff with OER, like maybe a couple of colleges in the area or in California. Places like Open Commons, OpenStax, Merlot. I'm curious, like what, thinking back on your kind of experience and maybe even now, what resources would have been helpful to you, like that you wish you would have had in trying to find OER and vet OER?
I think for me, it would have been nice if we just were able to go to one site and see a list of things rather than having to go here and there. And but part of the fun for me is to actually find stuff that I like and a variety of stuff. So like a textbook, maybe you get one author and that one author's point of view. With OER, you get to pick and choose. You get to have different backgrounds, mindsets. So that builds in inclusivity. Oh boy, tongue-tied this morning. Into the classroom with the materials that you are putting into the classroom as well. So I like that.
Sorry, I was muted. I would echo that. I think that the hardest part is there's not necessarily one place to go, and you have to poke around and find those things like Stephanie was mentioning that are the ones that work best for you. And then once you find one that's like a good campus or something, you can go back to it. I've also been sort of experimenting with looking at other disciplines, so things that are adjacent disciplines, to see what I can beg, borrow, or steal. Although it's not stealing because it's OER, so it's all good.
So a challenge for us in physics, and this might be true in math too, I don't know, is that so since we weren't using the fancy publisher homework stuff, we were creating, we did quite a lot of content creation and that homework solutions and diagrams and that sort of thing. And I am still trying to figure out how do I transform all of that work such that it's accessible. The diagrams, the math, all that stuff. So that's a work in progress. But even what I would say is even if you don't have everything perfect, like your first time through to go for it and change up to OER, that's okay, right? It can be a work in progress and there can be stages that take some time. It still benefits students a lot.
Great, thank you.
Real quick, and I
Yeah.
also the way that Stephanie, you talk to your students about the material itself, and I think that's kind of like I think that's fun to teach your students to actually look at the material in that kind of lens as well. I think it's important.
Great. Yeah, and folks are sharing some really great tips in the chat as well, including the OER kind of top, what is it called? It's like top 100 courses in Washington. So there's even some Washington State examples if you're curious. So Christy put a link in there in the chat. And also hot tip from Lauren. And as a fellow librarian, I really like this tip of putting LibGuide next to your search. Because usually library guides, it's kind of short for library guides, have already kind of compiled some sources for you. So that's a good hot tip. Okay, so next question. What impacts has kind of the open education approach or OER or OER had on your teaching and curriculum design?
I'm waiting for you now, Brandon.
I know, I was
going
gonna,
first.
someone wants to go first.
I can go first. I can go first. I'll get you off that. I didn't want to step on your toes. We had a certain rhythm going. I think in terms of kind of course design, is maybe where I would start. I like the flexibility that OER has where I can follow the students. So if my students are needing something specific, I can go and find an OER resource and provide them with it. So I can do things on the fly and I can adapt things like, hey, they're all struggling with figuring out the difference between an academic source and a popular source. And hey, I found this thing like a LibGuide that I can use that can help them. And I can find multiple things Whereas, not to say that we couldn't do that in conjunction with a textbook, but it's nice to have it there and to know where to go. So once you've kind of experienced that steep learning curve of how to find OER materials, it becomes much easier to find those things when you need them and be able to kind of pinpoint them.
I think to kind of add on to that, I also like getting students' opinions and point of views in there as well with the material. So through like formative assessments, I will put a question in my formative assessment and ask them, what kind of materials did you like? What kind of materials would you like? So that kind of helped with creating that classroom as well.
I would say every and any decision I make that centers students more in my teaching, including going to OER, anytime I make a decision like that, it invigorates my teaching and makes me more excited about what I'm doing. And this is one of those things. This certainly changed some of how we, like not being able to use the homework software, and we had to go kind of back to basics in some ways, but I always consider that to be a good thing. I like to kind of get the rug pulled out from under me a little bit. I like to have to refresh things and to have to, kind of smash them and start again. So it's my style, I think, to want to do that anyway.
Okay, any other thoughts? Okay. So what impacts have you noticed that OER has had? And this kind of is a nice segue. I think we've kind of talked about this already a little bit. What kind of impacts has OER had on student learning and engagement in your courses and programs? Because we talked a little bit about student kind of feedback and involvement in actually kind of vetting or voting maybe on OER materials, but I'm curious what other kinds of impacts you've observed on student learning and engagement.
Well, some of the feedback that I get from students in my assessments includes talking about the OER materials and the variety that I have in the classroom. So I don't only have like, here's an article or here's a chapter in a book. I have videos and podcasts that I include in my classes, and they like the variety because they like to learn in different ways. So I try to engage them in different ways that they would like to be engaged in. So I like that part.
I agree. I mean, I think having those multiple modes of delivery really helps, because I know some students, they may prefer to listen to a podcast than read a chapter, and even if they're doing both, one might stick in their brain a little bit more. So I think that, especially in the world that we live in, there is a tendency to, when people are doing research or trying to learn things on their own, gravitate towards podcasts and videos just organically.
Yeah, I would echo what both Brenda and Michael have said. And my students are very digitally literate, and I think it's fun when we get to go back and forth with links to things, and they're really comfortable sending me something and saying like, what's going on here? And I found this. And the fact that we can have kind of conversations that way and have the course materials be in that mix, not some like static textbook that's sitting on their desk that maybe they'll take a picture of, or something like that in order to integrate it. So it feels really natural the way the course materials are integrated in the conversations I have with students too.
Great, thank you. So this is sort of potentially related to the question I asked earlier about if there were any hesitations about adopting OER, but what challenges have you faced in adopting OER?
I think for me and my more non-intro courses, I have harder time finding material. So once again, it's that finding that material that I like or that students tend to like as well. So I also feel like the support from the schools that I teach in it's not there as much as I would like it to be there. Or the community at the school, because right now I don't feel like there's much OER community here at this campus. And I would like there to be more engagement, more talk about it. Where can we find it? Where can we build it? Where are you finding these type of things? So I feel that camaraderie around it would help a lot as well.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that, to maybe go back a little bit, one of the things I like about OER is the iterative nature of it. That depending on the license that you assign to something, or that somebody assigns to something, there is an ability to take something and adapt it. And I think that as a community within our disciplines, or as a campus, we're all learning from each other and borrowing things from each other. And that's what OER does, I think, on a much larger scale. And I had something else, but it's gone out of my brain. I apologize.
Like Brandon, I'd like to see a stronger community here too, based, like, fueled by the desire for equity, really. And that to me is just super strong. But and it's, it's underpinned by my own experience as a student who would get a syllabus and then see the books that were required and realize I can't take this class, and all of a sudden I have to find another class, and all the classes are already full, and like those experiences, that's stressful stuff. And the fact that it's in my control to make that better for somebody now is a powerful thing. One of the big challenges for us in physics was all the work that it took to do this. And we had to get creative, and thanks to my boss for helping to support this. I do feel like I have a very supportive environment in STEM to do this work and be supported both ideologically and in a practical sense too. But we had to figure out a way. It's me and a wonderful cadre of associate faculty. How can we pay people for the work to do this? It takes a lot of hours to do this. These are questions that we have to answer. This is a huge workload, and not everybody gets to take a sabbatical to convert their department or their classes, whatever. That's not practical. So I think we need to have practical conversations about how we can make this happen.
Yeah, and actually, right on that note, what would you like to see? What would you like to implement or try out with OER and open pedagogy in the future? And also, what would you like to see next in terms of development and support for OER and open pedagogy at Shoreline Community College? So we've mentioned a little bit more community building around this, a little bit more of a network of support, also compensation, funding, providing the time to be able to do this. I'm curious if there's any other thoughts. So that was kind of two questions in one, and I'll type them in the chat. I kind of forgot to type some of the questions in chat, so I apologize to folks, but I'll go ahead and see if anyone has any thoughts to start with.
I'll start on this.
Go for it. No, you go.
Okay, great.
I'm like, I got an answer for this one right now. And that is, I want to hear student voices. I want to amplify student voices. I want students to know that they have agency here, that they have a voice. They can speak up and say, this is what we want. This is why we want this. So I don't know that students, I would like to see that awareness raised so that they realize that. I don't know if they necessarily know. I put out a little survey in my classes just to kind of help raise that awareness. Like, did you know, kind of thing. But I think we could do a lot more with that here.
Yeah, agreed. I think, one of the things that I think about is at the end of every quarter, my final in English 101 and 102 is a reflection letter, which asks the students to think not only about their performance, but about the class itself, what could have been better, what assignments were helpful, what readings were helpful, and whatnot. Much like kind of Brandon's sort of question of what materials did you like, and what would you like more of, that sort of what would help you learn the material. Because if it's, if you're struggling to learn the material, perhaps another resource would help, or altering the instruction a little bit. But, I would love to see that, again, that community building and the awareness I think Brandon spoke to this a little bit earlier too, with people being hesitant, maybe OER having a little bit of a bad name. I think if, as faculty and students, we can embrace it and like raise the awareness that those materials are there and accessible and usable, and build on that rather than just, pulling the resources out. But I think that also contributing back into it by developing more resources.
I would also jump on that. Maybe creating like a faculty learning community here, where we can, like Christy put into chat, like put information up in Commons, Canvas Commons ourselves, so that we have access to these type of things and we can edit those. That's another place that I looked is Canvas Commons.
Yeah, I've used Canvas Commons too, and I found some really great material on there. Okay, so we've basically gone through the questions that I had, but I'm curious, I wanted to check in with the panelists really quick. Are you okay if we open it up to audience questions at this point? Does that sound good? Okay, and it looks like Cheryl already has one.
Sorry, I was a little early on that.
But that's all right. You were ready for it. Yeah.
I'm realizing I'm doing this. I didn't realize the name for it exactly, or any of this. I'm in the nursing department. And one of the things, somebody was talking about podcasts, and there's a lot of good podcasts out there. I just recently served on a review for some diversity modules that are going to be coming out. And one of my comments about a podcast that was recommended is I didn't know anything about the person that was talking. I went to the website and it was Dr. So-and-so, which was great. But as we know with COVID, there's lots of Dr. So-and-so that say a lot of varied things about certain things. And number one, I want reference materials. And so there's certain, like I just added to my vaccine lecture, This Podcast Will Kill You is a really great podcast, but it has all sorts of references that are always included, book references and article references, journal articles, and so on. So I'm not going to just include anything, even if it's good content, because I'm concerned about lack of reference. And I want my students to have an ability to understand it's not just somebody who's pop culture or a cultural source, or I forget what somebody used the term, but I want it to be credible source and evidence-based source. So that's one of the things I've run into.
Thank you, Cheryl. I think I see Joyce has their hands up.
Yeah, my question is about student learning. There was some research some years ago showing that learning from printed materials works better for many people than from digital materials. However, that might be changing with what people are getting used to. And I'm wondering what your experience is in terms of the learning of the material through all the digital content as opposed to used to be the printed.
I can jump in on that one real quick. I think the students are more digitally savvy. They're more used to it. So I think that it's comfortable to them. Some students that are maybe closer to my age tend to print things out and read them. But one of the things that I like is that they're very adept at using technology to their advantage when they're reading things. So they know what software they can use to augment things. So it seems to me as though they're retaining the information and learning it as well as they had in the past, if not maybe a little bit better, because they can have I can ask them in class, look up the article on your phone, and they can go and they can look at it right then.
So Michael, do you teach in your class like how to make those notes digitally or bookmarks and things? I mean, I'm somebody obviously also from an older generation, like I don't know how to do those things, and I'm not so sure that my kids who are in their 20s know how to do it. Well, one certainly does, but the other probably does not. So I don't know that they all get taught how to do that in their high schools or whatever. Do you teach that?
I would agree with you 100%. I teach close reading, and I talk about how to approach a text. The students who are savvy, they come with it, and it's beyond me and beyond my curmudgeonly stance that we should be reading things and they should be printing things. There's got to be an OER resource out there for it, right?
Joyce, good question. I use all OpenStax stuff, so students can print anything they want. They can order print copies from Amazon, like that's all in the user interface there. And there's also a like note-taking and highlighting ability inside the online textbook. So, different I don't know, textbooks are different. We'll have different technologies, but I agree that teaching that is probably something that we should do. When it comes to homework, like my students are doing their homework on paper, whereas before they were using a publisher digital tool to do that. So that's actually a little more old school than it used to be.
So last one, do you see a difference between introductory courses? Like, for example, in physics, you have your 110 or your 114, and they may be students who maybe are, I don't know, not necessarily, but less familiar with this type of learning and those materials compared to, well, I mean, obviously, if they're in a sequence, they have used a decoder before, but what differences do you notice? Like, Michael, are you using an English 101, which could be the very first quarter that the student is in college altogether, compared to, say, in English 102, they might have used it before. And I'm just still wondering, I mean, I love a lot of the equity positive impact, but I am also concerned about the equity negative impact for people who don't have good technology at home and didn't get a lot of that in their previous education.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I think the negative aspect that you bring up is interesting. How, to me, it's kind of it's a hard split to make, right? Because if we're, as we've been talking about, if we require only a printed book, right, the older model, that could be prohibitive. But are we also prohibiting other people for using only one source that's online and they don't have reliable internet or something like that? My inclination is to say, most students these days at least have a phone, although this is something that I'm struggling with more recently. Students that are having a hard time accessing things online. They can't find things. Or links change. So I don't think OER is a perfect solution at this point, but I do think it has a lot of potential. I don't know if that answers your question.
I just, I'm just thinking a little bit about what Stephanie mentioned and what some folks have been putting in the chat as well in regards to your question, Joyce, yeah, if it is really open, exactly, Christy, I was just about to say the same thing. It can be printed. It doesn't have to be digital. And so I know some bookstores actually do print out OER materials that folks are using for their classes, so people can go grab that. And I think it's usually, I don't know if there's a huge cost associated with that. I'm not sure. But yeah, exactly. And Stephanie, that's a really good point. It doesn't remedy tech inequities. And I think that's a larger issue, right? So how do we make sure that folks can get access to this material if they need it? So for example, laptop checkouts, we have laptops through the library, but that's one little piece. I think it needs to be a broader conversation. But yeah, it's a really good point. Did that answer your question, Joyce?
Yeah, thanks. I was actually sitting here, we've been talking in some different rooms of people about small classes that can augment students' class load. And I was just thinking like something on like technology for learning or whatever. That's a 2-credit class. I don't know. That was my idea kind of coming from this. And also I think a lot of students don't know that they can get a laptop from their school.
Right.
So just encouraging all of you to keep, I don't know, put it in your syllabus, mention it in your first class and so forth. A lot of students actually don't know that. Of course, it's on our website somewhere, but as a student, you wouldn't necessarily find that.
Yeah, it's important to share these resources out, right? Because often they're there and folks just aren't aware of them. Yeah, good point. Okay, any other questions for the panelists? We've got about a couple of minutes left. Or any other, oh, Joyce, you got another one? Go for it. I don't see anyone else with a hand up or that's unmuted themselves yet, so.
So I'm also wondering, and I think that was kind of part of the goal of this session, talk about like, how has it changed your actual pedagogy? I mean, it's been mentioned that now you have different materials, you can have different voices, and also, you know, it could be podcasts or videos and not just text. But when you think about how you, not just presenting materials or the way that you structure the learning, what changes have taken place because of this?
I feel my students are more engaged with the materials that I bring in there. And they're engaged with more than just one. So I have options for them for different types of material for them to go over. I have like, you should look at this one, and then here's the options. So I see that they're actually looking at the optional material as well, more than if you just have the regular textbook in there. So they're more engaged with different types of material. And I see that in the way that they're discussing things in either discussion questions or in their papers or in their homework assignments, that they're actually using those optional ones.
And oh, I think we've got maybe, I wanted to make sure, Michael, Stephanie, did you have anything you wanted to add to that before because I have another note about that question too.
Just, mine hasn't even changed all that much, actually. I was using a lot of my own materials before anyway, and kind of shaping my course. And the OpenStax textbooks are very much like traditional textbooks. If you're looking for something that's, you know, kind of more like a traditional textbook, written by like authors you've heard of at universities you've heard of, OpenStax is a good source for that.
Thank you. And I think just another personal note, I've heard of different projects where students are actually co-creating open educational resources with their instructors. And I think that's really powerful. You know, really students seeing themselves as scholars, as creators. So I think OER has the potential to highlight voices that typically don't get highlighted in traditional publishing. So that's something that I've noticed a lot with OER. Okay, I think we're about at the end, but any last minute thoughts or questions? Yeah, thanks to our panelists. I really appreciate your time and your knowledge and all of your great experiences with experimenting with this thing that does take a little bit of time, right? To vet sources, to find them, to figure out how to evaluate them and assess them and use them in your courses. So I really appreciate your time. And thanks to everyone that attended. I appreciate your engagement and questions. And yeah, I hope we can build a little bit more of a community around open educational resources on campus. So great. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.